There is a nature reserve in Tyabb Victoria at the bottom of Australia, and at its outer edge is a giant cricket field, which is home to the Tyabb Yabbies Cricket Club, a team locals can join if they enjoy a hit on the weekend. But in 2014, it became the scene of one of Australia's most notorious crimes. So it's just after 6:30 on a warm February evening. The sun is starting to go down and it's casting shadows all across the field. The huge tall lights are starting to come on as the under-12s cricket team are finishing up their practice session. As the kids are starting to walk over, their parents are standing on the sideline just casually talking to one another. And it's this setting that plays out thousands of times per night at sporting fields all across Australia. But on this particular night, as the parents started ushering their kids to the cars they started to leave, a father and son stayed behind in the batting cages. The child's mother stands up on the hill looking down. Now for this mother, a woman named Rosie, a fear that she'd been harbouring deep inside her since she was 6 years old was only moments away from being realised. Rosemary Ann Batty was born in 1962 in the rural English town of Laneham. She grew up on a farm with 3 older brothers, and when she was just 6 years old, tragedy would strike the family. Rosie's mother would pass away suddenly, but instead of the children finding out about it on the day of her passing, they only learned of her death on the day of her funeral, as they were all getting ready to attend it. It would be from this point on that little Rosie would be sent to a boarding school. And when she wasn't at the boarding school, she would be looked after by nannies and her grandmother. So for little Rosie, a lot has changed in such a short amount of time. From the loss of her mother to now being sent away to boarding schools and being looked after by strangers, it was a big change for a little girl. So as Rosie grew into her teenage years, the fact that she was only ever notified of her mother's passing the day of her funeral, well, it weighed very heavily on her. In fact, it was due to that sudden loss and the way everything was handled that she developed a deep fear of connecting with other people. So it was from that point on that Rosie decided that she was never going to get married, she was never going to have children, and she was never going to start a family. She had effectively built up a solid brick wall between herself and everybody else, never letting anybody get too close. At 16 years old, Rosie was done with school, and she developed the travel bug. She wanted to get as far away from Laneham as she possibly could. So from here, she becomes a secretary at a bank and she starts saving up her money. By now, it's the late 1970s, and Rosie decides to travel to Europe, and it's while she's in Europe that she lands a job as an au pair, which is a nanny that lives with wealthy families and looks after their children. But by 1986, Rosie had developed a new obsession and a new adventure. She wanted to travel all the way to Australia, and her dream was to backpack around it. And she did just that. After her adventure in Australia, she heads back to the UK in 1987, but she doesn't stay long. You see, by 1988, 26-year-old Rosie, well, she was back, and this time she was in a de facto relationship with an Australian man, so she could stay in Australia permanently. So Rosie moves to Victoria, and it's there where she buys a house in a place called Dandenong. By 1990, Rosie is working at an employment agency where her job was to try and get staff for clients. And this is where she meets a man named Greg Anderson. And Greg Anderson works for this agency. So basically, it's like temp work. So he could go and work in warehousing as a pick packer or forklift driver. They have admin roles. They send different people to different places of employment to fill in for staff. And this is what Greg did. He was one of their workers while Rosie worked for the actual agency getting staff. And it's not before too long when Rosie and Greg actually start up a relationship. But from the outset of their relationship, it is marred with domestic issues of the violent type. Greg had become extremely controlling and demanding, and he had become sexually aggressive. So what that basically means is like unwanted sexual behavior in like a forceful, coercive, or threatening manner. This is sort of what Greg was like. Now, it's 1992 and the couple had been together for 2 years when Rosie calls it off. She's like, I'm done with this guy. And the reason she was done with him is because allegedly he had tried to grape one of her friends. So it's like a pretty good reason to give Greg the punt, I would think. And it's not long after this when Rosie decides to pack up her life in Victoria and she heads to the bright lights of Sydney. And it's while she's in Sydney, she works in IT. She actually works for a telecommunications company. And she does that for a little while, but after some time had passed, she started missing her old friends back in Dandenong. She missed her life back there. So by 2000, she actually moves back to Victoria. And it's while she's back in Dandenong, she goes back to old stomping ground, that one day she just runs into Greg Anderson, her former boyfriend from like 8 years ago. And Greg's like, hey, I haven't seen you in a minute. What have you been up to? And she's like, not much. We should catch up. And they do. And things... Well, she would say later on that it was probably the biggest mistake of her life. Now, one thing leads to another, and the couple start hooking up. But Rosie, this time, she's like, you know what? I don't want a relationship with you, Greg. We're just going to keep this casual. So they just have a little bit of casual fun, I guess you would call it. Like, she had basically worked out that Greg was just not the long-term type of dude to have around, I guess. Because you see... Greg was kind of, he was a strange dude, let's just put it that way. He was a strange guy. And not a great lot is actually known about him, unfortunately. But he clearly didn't like working because, like, you know, he never really held a job for very long. And it would be in his early years when he would, like, bounce from religion to religion. He'd go to Islam, Catholicism, Christianity. He was, like, looking for, like, some sort of purpose and a place for him to belong. Like, he did that a lot when he was younger. I don't get it. But it's during these hookup sessions between Rosie and Greg when, in 2001, Rosie unexpectedly becomes pregnant. Because that's kind of what happens, like, if, you know, you're sleeping together with no protection. And this was not planned, obviously. But basically, Rosie's, like, nearly 40 years old. And she's now pregnant. And she decides straight off the bat that she is going to raise this child on her own as a single mother. But again, this is like a huge shock to Rosie because she never wanted kids. She never wanted to get married. She never wanted to settle down because of that fear that she had from when she was like 6 years old. So she's really like, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And it's not like she was the only one. Like, her brothers back in the UK were the exact same. Like, they never settled down and have families either, apparently. So clearly that the sudden loss of their mother and how it was sort of handled affected all of them in some sort of way. But given the fact the seed had been planted already, so to speak, Rosie, she's going to have this child. And on June 20th, 2002, she gives birth to a baby boy that she names Luke. So Luke Batty. Rosie totally gave Luke her last name and not the father Greg's. So that tells you everything you need to know. And they're not even really friends either at this point because Greg had started up his BS again. You know, his controlling behavior, trying to tell Rosie what she could and couldn't do in her own house. And, you know, he throws like temper tantrums. He had an explosive temper and he was controlling and manipulative. He just wasn't a very good guy. So Rosie really didn't want him around, but at the same time, she didn't want to keep Luke from him. And by all accounts, like, Greg was a doting father. Like, he loved little Luke. So it's by 2004 when things between Rosie and Greg become extremely volatile because Greg starts stalking her, he's intimidating and threatening her, and she has no choice but to go to the police. Now, this is where a 10-year-long back and forth with police involvement and court-ordered intervention starts. And there's a big problem with this that we'll get into in a bit. But the thing with Greg, as bad as things were sometimes, there were also times where he was really good. Like, it was like up and down. It was like a yo-yo. And eventually this would just lead to him having absolutely no contact with Luke, which is not really what Rosie wanted. Like, she could see the problems that Greg was having were more with her and not his son. Like, he loved his son and she knew that. But by this stage, he was just getting too out of control. So he has no contact with little Luke. Now, part of the reason that happened is when Luke was very small, he witnessed his father, Greg, attacking his mother, Rosie. Now, Greg was chasing her around her own place, and she was trying to get away from him, and Luke went and hid. And then when it was all over, little Luke came out, and he actually apologized to his mother, and he said, "I wish I could have done something. I'm just too little." And Rosie looked at him in the eyes and said, "That is not your responsibility. I'm really sorry you had to see that." Like, this is the type of person Greg was to do that in front of his kid. But from all accounts, from what his mother Rosie said, Luke was this very kind and loving boy. He used to write his mum little notes telling her how much he loved her. Now, by 2012, Greg Anderson, Luke's father, things go from bad to worse with this guy. Like, he is getting more and more out of control. He's now in his 50s. He's jobless, and he actually gets caught at the local library looking at CP, child images, on the local library. Like, genius, right? And of course the librarian is seeing this because they can monitor your screens, and contacts the police, and Greg is arrested and he's charged with that. Now, Greg, by this stage, he had been arrested and charged with multiple offences dealing with Rosie by this stage, and he really knew how to navigate the police and the court systems. Like, he was like a pro at it, and he basically knew that because he was so hard to track down, the police really sometimes couldn't enforce a lot of this stuff, because it's not like he had a job where they knew he was going to be from 8 to 5 or whatever. Like, this guy could be anywhere, and he constantly moved around, so the police had a hard time tracking him down and enforcing some of these intervention orders. Now, it would be from this point on in late 2012 when Greg started having, I guess, homicidal fantasies and thoughts, and he was spiraling. Mentally, he was spiraling. He had cut off all contact with his family, like his actual family, like his mother, father, and if he had siblings, like, he didn't talk to them anymore. And in fact, a very frightening situation would take place when Greg was visiting little Luke, because by this stage, he had his visitation rights given back to him because he was behaving for a little bit. But while he was sitting in the car with Luke, he pulls out a knife and he looks at Luke with it and he says, "It can all end with this." Now, little Luke tells his mum Rosie, who contacts the police straight away, but the police can't do anything because the way he worded it, it wasn't a direct threat. He just said, "It can all end with this." And to the police, that means anything, I guess. Now, by late 2013, things go from bad to worse for Greg Anderson. I mean, he's charged with the child image thing in 2012. In early 2013, he didn't threaten his own son with a knife, but in late 2013, Greg actually becomes homeless because what he had ended up doing is he threatened a roommate that he lived with a knife. He threatened to decapitate him, probably over someone drinking his Coke out of the shared fridge or something. The guy's a nutcase. So the police are notified, the owner of the property is notified, Greg is given the boot, and now he's living in his car. So he's homeless now. And by this stage, Rosie does have in place an AVO, and the AVO basically tells Greg that he can't go anywhere near where she lives, and he can't go to Luke's school. Now, public places like sporting grounds, like this cricket field, Greg can go to. Now, it's February 12th, 2014. It's 5 p.m. when Rosie and Luke arrive by car to the Bungian Reserve Oval in Tyabb for Luke's cricket training session. Now, when Rosie drives into the car park, straight away she sees Greg's car. So she knows Greg's there. Now, she's a little bit tense, but when she parks and Greg wanders over, Greg's actually in a really good mood. So this really puts Rosie at ease. She's like, "Oh, thank God, I'm not going to have issues with this clown tonight." And of course, you got to think Rosie feels a little bit more safer because there are other people there. There are other parents there. There are fathers there. So they're out in public. So Rosie's not really at a heightened sense around Greg in this setting. Now, Greg immediately hugs his son Luke before Luke races off to do his cricket training. He exchanges pleasantries with Rosie before he sort of wanders off to talk to some other parents, and Rosie goes and sits in a car. By 6:30, cricket training is starting to wrap up, and the kids are making their way over to their parents, who are gathering them up, and they're heading off. Now, Greg walks with Luke over to Rosie, and he asks her, can I have some more time with my son? We're going to go to the batting cages and I'll bowl the ball to him and he can hit, and we're just going to do a little bit more practice afterwards. Now, Rosie's okay with that. She's like, yeah, go for it, because Greg doesn't get to see Luke that much. So she sees it as a great father-son bonding opportunity. So Greg and Luke start walking over to the batting cages, and it's at this point that the sun is starting to go down. And they get to the batting cages and Luke's there with the cricket bat and Greg's bowling him some balls. Now, some parents are still around when they see Greg walking over to Luke. And it's from the car park that people can hear Greg. It sounds like Greg's yelling at Luke. And then all of a sudden, Greg hits Luke over the head with the cricket bat. And as Rosie's standing on the hill, she hears like this very short, blood-curdling scream, and she looks over there as well. And Greg has got little Luke on the ground by his neck, and he's hitting him with the bat. Parents start running over there when Greg pulls out a knife from his jacket, and he rams it into Luke's neck. Now, Greg is waving the knife around at all the other parents, and he even stabs himself like he's trying to self-delete at this point. Not even a minute after Greg started attacking Luke, the police and the ambulance were called. Now, it wouldn't be too long before the police actually arrived to the Oval, and they head straight down to where Greg is and Luke is, and as soon as the police see that Greg's got a knife, they draw their weapons. It's at this time, with the guns drawn on Greg, that the paramedics arrive, but they can't go to Luke until this whole situation with Greg is handled. Greg, by this stage, he's shouting incoherently and he's threatening to stab anyone that comes near him. It would be in these next few minutes when negotiations with Greg and the police would fail, and the police would have no other option but to shoot him. This would allow the paramedics to race over to Luke and start performing life-saving measures. Rosie at this time had been ushered to a police car where she was sitting in the back, and police told her that she's to stay there, don't go anywhere near the scene. When the paramedics were finally able to reach Luke, he was barely alive. He had sustained massive head injuries. So they performed their life-saving measures, put him in the ambulance and raced him to hospital. But unfortunately, by the time 11-year-old Luke Batty made it to hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival. His father, Greg, would be airlifted to hospital where he would also be pronounced dead when he got there. The Luke Batty murder by his father, Greg Anderson, well, it exposed severe flaws within the family violence and child protection systems that were put in place here in Australia. Greg's multiple court-ordered interventions were poorly enforced. He had a long, well-documented history of violence, stalking, and making threats towards Rosie Batty. And despite all these breaches that he did against Rosie, the courts decided to treat each incident as a singular thing, as a solo event and not a pattern of behaviour. The system that was set up to protect children failed to prioritise the child. Now, that was something we saw in my last video about John Edwards. The exact same thing happened where CPS, Child Protective Service, or DOCS, Department of Child Services here in Australia, they were forcing the kids to see their father, who was a violent man. That's not John Edwards the medium, by the way. But all in all, it was the lack of cooperation between the agencies. There was just a lack of communication. One hand didn't know what the other one was doing. The police, the courts, child protection, they just weren't sharing information with one another. But for a lot of people, this was the first time that they really witnessed domestic violence at that scale in such a public place. It really brought eyes to the problem that we have here in Australia, because Greg Anderson, people that knew him would not have thought he would have done that. It could be a neighbour, it could be a friend, it could be a family member. And that's what people realised after this whole Greg Anderson situation where he murdered his son Luke Batty. Like, 1 minute they're normal and then they just switch. In the years after Luke Batty's death, his mother Rosie would actually become one of Australia's top domestic violence advocates. She was actually a founding member of the Victim Survivors Advisory Council in Victoria, and this would actually win her Australian of the Year. So she's doing amazing work. Her story is helping so many people. But Rosie knows why Greg did it. He did it to hurt her. He loved Luke. There was no doubt about it, but he hated Rosie. So he wanted to take away the most precious thing in her life. So that is the story of Greg Anderson, the man who murdered his own son, Luke Batty, in the aftermath, and what Rosie Batty went on to do. Great things, I guess. with such a tragic story. So if you like the video, like the video. If you didn't, down thumb it. I'll be trying to drop a video every week. So if you like this type of content, definitely consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, you stay safe out there in internet land. By car to Bunyan Reserve Bunyan.